at a certain point, we have to hold ourselves accountable as women and say, it's barely been 50 years that we can even have a credit card, that we can own property, that we can do things in our own name. To be so eager to give up all of that and to go back into this place of voluntary helplessness and voluntary ignorance in service of a very specific kind of love, to me, is we just can't allow ourselves to do that.
Hello, hello. I'm Brittany Luce, and you're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR, a show about what's going on in culture and why it doesn't happen by accident. Girl math. I'm just a girl, and living a soft life aren't just fun trends. They're financial fantasies. Chelsea Fagan, author and CEO of The Financial Diet, joins the show to unpack how our romantic pursuits, romance novels, and even the way we think about aging are all wrapped up in our insecurities surrounding class. Chelsea, welcome to It's Been a Minute.
Hi, thank you for having me. This is so exciting.
Listen, I'm excited. I have been getting all types of advice from you and your guests for a very long time. Sometimes I hear some of their voices in the back of my head. I'm about to make an unwise purchase, and it thwarts me. So I'm grateful for that. So I'm very excited to have you here today. But I want to talk today not so much about financial advice, but financial fantasies, because I feel like, I don't know, sometimes I feel like the lifeblood of the internet is financial fantasy. So I want to start by asking you, what is the number one financial fantasy brain rot that we have all been ingrained to think is reasonable that you see floating around the internet?
Oh, well, I mean, for women, it's definitely the idea that being entirely reliant on a man is aspirational. That's a big one.
Mm.
And also, I think there's a real resurgence of this really delusional class fantasy for women that a wealthy man will kind of pluck you out of obscurity and give you this really, really fabulous life. And what's ironic about that, to be clear, people have generally always married within their social class. But
Mm.
what's even funnier about it now is that years ago, very rich men wanted a stay-at-home wife and mother. Now, the very rich lawyer wants another lawyer. The very rich doctor wants another doctor. Like,
What's better than
even
one
in
income? Two.
exactly, like,
Yeah.
but it's a level of stratification of class that is on along so many more axes than it ever was before. It's like, if you're a lower income woman, not only are you probably not going to marry a wealthy man because of the class difference, but also because he's likely looking for a woman who is extremely educated in similar circles, works a very similar job, and essentially brings as much to the table as he does in terms of
Hmm.
status, in terms of income. Which, by the way, doesn't work out super well even for the women who are in these marriages. There are tons of memoirs about that. But I
Yeah.
think it's a real fantasy that I see a lot more on social media now.
We will definitely be getting into that. It's interesting too that you bring that up because it feels the other sort of very, I think, dude focused financial fantasy that I see floating around does not really support this like class fantasy that many women are investing in. The one I see floating around for dudes, I think is just complete brain rot, is just the idea that um sports betting, online sports gambling, is a great side hustle. That feels like a big fantasy. But I want to circle back to something that you touched on, which is the idea that there are that there are already women who have lived the reality end of this fantasy idea that a man can take care of you. I mean, really what that's about is learning from the people that came before you and kind of absorbing their financial wisdom and their financial lessons from these hard won life lessons that they've, come into. It makes me think about You're Just Getting Good videos. I love them, where you specifically interview women over 50 about their financial lives. So good. So good. There are so many lessons in there. But I love it because it gives us a look at many women's financial realities, as opposed to kind of like the projections that we see a lot of online. Very often, the women that you interview are single or happily divorced or just simply living life on their own terms. And they're very happy about it. What made you start this series, and what were you hoping your audience would gain from it?
Well, several years ago, I made the choice to only really follow women over 50 on social media, outside of women that I actually know, obviously.
Wow.
But in terms of like influencers, creators, things like that, um, mostly because I think that if we don't really go out of our way to seek that out, especially social media really just kind of redounds to this extremely youth oriented view
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
life. And I think that ageism and sort of self-loathing around age for women especially is something that it's a current that you have to actively swim against.
Yeah.
And I do think that for as certainly we're far from perfect, but I think as much as we may have advanced in other ways over the past 20 plus years, 30 years maybe, on having more progressive and inclusive ideas of beauty and worth and value and attractiveness and sexuality and all of those things. I think if anything, we've probably regressed somewhat in terms of age,
Mm.
because I do think that even looking at just how um, bisected women are in the public eye simultaneously as we're being kind of fed these very regressive narratives around being supported by a man or finding your identity and value in a man. I think what it often combines to create in women is this idea that they if they're unfulfilled, if they're unhappy, if they're in a sexless marriage, if they don't like their career, if they any of these things, that once they've passed a certain point in life, there's no point in starting over. There's no point in changing their mind. Because who would want them, or what would be out there for them? And I think that in and of itself, I think most women know, if it's not their own case personally, they know it in their own family. They've seen it all around them. Women who have just lost, frankly, decades to this sunk cost fallacy of what else is out there for me. And almost every woman that we've had on the
Mm.
show, their life, I ask them, the first question in every episode is, when did life really start getting good for you? No one has set an age under 40.
I find it interesting, but also like, I mean, incredibly encouraging. Makes you think about like, I don't know if you read the book by Miranda July, All Fours.
I
Um,
surely did.
yes, and so we got to have her on the show when this book came out a couple years ago, and we talked about this line from a doctor in the book, which talks about how like, for many women, like post menopause is the happiest time in their lives, like basically outside of childhood. And that's just so like the idea that like you said, that things are just getting good when you hit your 40s, 50s, 60s. um that's something that actually bears out in the data when you think about it from that perspective, that like the later years can be happier for many, many, many women. And I love that that is reflected through the lens of finance on your show. I wonder what's like the biggest like fantasy or assumption about women and money that you've like been able to successfully debunk through this series.
Hmm. I think probably the number one is that men have a more natural aptitude toward managing money. I don't think that's true at all. And
Hmm.
actually, when you look at the data, most heterosexual couples, the woman manages all of the day to day financial decisions, which make up most of your financial life. They just
Shopping, cooking, cleaning, all of the products and things that people interact with on a day-to-day basis. Furniture, I mean, they're very much along like gendered lines, but I mean that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense.
totally. However, they don't either, they're not allowed to, or they don't ask to, or it just shakes out that they don't manage all of the long-term finances, the retirement,
Hmm.
estate planning, investment, all of that kind of stuff. So I think that that is the number one thing that we try to push back on, is this idea that men have some inherent quality that makes them better at financial planning. It's not true.
if I look at the way the world works, that many people's families works, many people's marriages work, that is like kind of like the silent assumption. Either even if a couple can manage finances together, very often, from what I've observed, at least from what I've observed, I've seen that like there's still an inclination to kind of defer or to do things as in such a way that would make the husband feel more comfortable.
I think male comfort is at the center of a lot of this. But also, I don't know. I think so. Something I joke about on the channel is that every woman needs to have like 37 of her own private emergency funds. Obviously, that's not true, but every woman should have at least one, right? That is just hers, that is just in her name, that can never be touched. Because even in the case of, let's say, an amicable divorce, or a regular division of assets, there could be a period of time where you can't access things that are jointly held, or
Right.
there could be a dispute around what percentage is yours versus his. And I think that feeling of like, even on a very logistical level, if I were to leave this relationship tomorrow, how would I eat? Where would I sleep? All of those questions.
Yeah.
A lot of women can't even get past that first step in terms of, how would I leave this relationship? And I think what's really tragic about that, about not having your own cash on hand, is that it makes it, to me, there can really never be any meaningful love or consent, to which there's no alternative, right? Like, to me, there's love isn't that meaningful when you can't opt out or say no. And so I think that when women deprive themselves of their own financial freedom and their own financial safety net, they've
Hmm.
sort of created a situation where, even if they love their husbands, well, they better, because they don't have a choice otherwise. Where are they going?
It's interesting. You are like in the unique position of like being both a financial educator and also a romance author. Do a little dance for that. Because I mean that's an extremely unique combination. It's so interesting to hear you talk about this because um I really enjoyed your perspective on like romance and finance and the intersection of those two things. Because I can't think of anybody else I know that is sitting at that specific intersection, right? It's made me very interested in your thesis, and you touched on this earlier in our conversation that most contemporary romance is a class fantasy as much as it is a romantic or sexual fantasy. You got into this a little bit, but please tell me more about that class fantasy in romance.
One of my least favorite phrases that I hear people sort of glibly say on social media: reading is inherently political.
Hmm.
I think that that is true, but I don't think that
Yeah.
that requires us to dig into what the politics are of what we're reading. I think
Mm.
that that sort of it's that statement to me implies that reading is inherently progressively political. And I actually think that a lot of contemporary fiction, and particularly contemporary fiction in the romance genre geared toward women, etc., is quite inherently conservative, in
Mm.
terms of the representation of, uh, as you said, the class fantasy of it, the sort of the norms around virginity, around experience, around who has the money and power, around what it means to
Uh-huh.
give that power up, around often the age differentials. It's not a coincidence, and I want to say there are many books, even in the genre of romance, that subvert this, that are totally outside of that
Yeah.
framework. But if you scan some of the most popular titles at any given time, what are you going to see for the men? There are huge themes, right? They're CEOs, they're bosses, they're
Mob
billionaires,
bosses. I
they're
feel like
mob
they're
bosses,
mob bosses increasingly.
they're princes, they're dukes, there's sort of an inherent underlying assumption that what the man is bringing to the relationship is as much about his power and his social status and his wealth as it is about anything he might be bringing sexually, romantically, etc. There's also,
Hmm.
again, often a serious age differential. And when you combine that with this sort of really strong orientation toward not just a quote unquote happily ever after, but in most cases a heterosexual marriage, in many cases a jump forward to having children. And so
Yeah.
I think I'm not going to say that you can't enjoy 50 Shades of Grey, for example. Enjoy it. Enjoy that. Enjoy
Well, there
all of the
also there
many
could be other
imitators that have
reasons to not
come.
enjoy 50 Shades of Grey.
True. True. But I do think it's really important to take a step back and look at books like that and say, what are the messages that this is giving me, not just about her and the main female character's role in this, but about him and why he's perceived as attractive, even though in the writing he sort of comes off as at best a blank slate, at worst a sociopath.
Hmm. I mean, you've given me a lot to chew on with that one. I mean, I'll say I love like a forced marriage like plot, but
No.
part of I love the forced marriage ones where it's like my aunt died and she left me millions of dollars, but the only way I can get it is if I get married in 30 days to a very handsome farmhand that lives nearby. I mean, listen, they got my number with those. But part of it is that financial fantasy of like, oh my God. It's like, I don't know, it's almost like a multi-level fantasy where it's like obviously like, yeah, there's the hot farmhand. And you're coming into money, but it's like coming into money that is not necessarily permanent. Like the source of the money is not the husband, but it's just falling into your lap. And also you get to have this incredible, sexy romance alongside it. I mean, we're only as sick as our secrets, so I'm going to share that. But no, I mean, definitely, like, I hadn't thought of myself as somebody who would be really kind of taken by that aspect of it because in my real life, like, I don't see that happening for me. B, I'm already married, and C, I that's not necessarily how I would conduct my financial life, like tying it to a much more powerful man. Like, so I'm like, I was thinking about that, and I was like, I'm immune to the financial fantasy, and I'm like, oh my God, no, I'm not. I love the idea of being forced to marry a hot guy in 30 days that I could divorce after and coming into millions of dollars. Like, it is it's a little bit, I mean, that's more of like I think an extreme example, and I'm definitely in a position where I'm not hoping or thinking that will happen to me. But I wonder, like, how do you see that kind of fantasy, like the rich, generous, sexy guy sweeping a woman off her feet? Because it's also incredibly heterosexual, by the way. Like, incredibly heterosexual, this fantasy. How do you see that bleeding into our real life romantic desires?
It's interesting. I came to the realization recently that I would say the genre that I probably read the most often is contemporary slash literary fiction with often a strong romantic theme. And I realized in looking back at the books that I've read over the past year that consistently my favorites have all been queer stories. Some
Hmm.
historical, some modern. But I think I realized that part of the reason why I find myself very drawn to a lot of queer romantic stories is because they sort of inherently don't come with this extraordinary baggage of gender, power, money, class, all of these things that to
Mm.
me are very, very hard to escape or subvert in more heterosexual romantic stories. And I think when you look at the exceeding popularity of the genre, what you just described, like I will assume about you that you are a very progressively minded woman and live a very progressive life. But what you
Mhm.
described there with like the forced marriage to a hot guy to inherit this fortune,
Can't
it
give it
it
up.
is not it it is in some way in conflict with the way you live and how you see yourself and the way you would probably want to handle a situation like that in real life.
Mhm.
And in some ways it's sort of almost this fantasy of giving up our power, this fantasy of the decision being made for us, this fantasy of just relaxing. And I think what that speaks
Yeah.
to in the modern woman is this real frustration with, we usually also have to work full time. We
Mhm.
also, generally speaking, do more of the housework. Like marriage in general is increasingly a losing proposition for the average heterosexual woman. So I think losing oneself in a sort of more in a fantasy of giving up control and power to a man, it makes total sense. But I think, if anything, it almost feels like a bit of, a very temporary reprieve from what are very real world material conditions that are getting worse.
I mean, it's also like a desire to like maybe, one day never have to do like do a new like job orientation ever again. Like, you know what I mean? Like not having to show up with my passport or two forms of ID. Like it's like, I mean, yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. This makes me think about something else that I feel like is really big right now in terms of how feels very adjacent to um this idea that, a man is going to take care of you 100% financially. Um which is like the idea of trad wife living. I mean, obviously there are people for whom this lifestyle works and everybody's healthy and happy, and like if that's you, like keep going with your life, obviously. But for the majority of heterosexual couples, as we have previously discussed on this show, like having a man who takes care of you financially so that you are at home, also working very often, but at home, taking care of your home and your children if you have them, or your pets or whatever, that is not the norm. Like that is not the norm for most heterosexual couples in America. That's just not the deal. But even if it is possible, there is a marked difference between the fantasy of being kept. Because right, like the trad wife fantasy to me is not like a one size fits all. There are some people who are like fantasizing about the ballerina farm lifestyle, you know, where they're like drinking the raw milk and they've got, 9 children and they're taking care of farm animals, all while also like marrying into a billionaire family. But also there are people for whom it's more of like I'm out all day buying Birkins and going shopping and like hitting up Starbucks. And not doing any sort of housework. Like the try wife fantasy it's just not one size fits all. But there is a marked difference between the fantasy of what that might be like versus the reality of it. Like, I wonder what's the long-term financial reality of relying on your boyfriend or husband financially?
I mean, it just comes down to that man, right? It comes down to how honest he is, how loyal he is, how financially disciplined he is, how good of a steward he is of your family's finance. Like it just depends on the man. Now, I will say
Mm,
this. There are situations in which, because oftentimes people will sort of project onto me that I just like don't think anyone can be a stay-at-home mother. That's not true. My sister's a stay-at-home mother. Like I think
mm,
that can be a valid life choice. But the level of protection that woman has to give herself in terms of money that is exclusively hers, in terms of a prenup that protects her, in terms
mm,
of accounts in her name, in terms of retirement in her name, in terms of property, in terms of everything, the level of above and beyond protections that she has to put in place to make sure that if anything were to happen, she won't be on the street essentially
yeah.
is very, very high. Because it's also important to remember that it's not just the years that this woman isn't earning, it is also the huge, huge cost to her career prospects if, she's out of the workforce for 10, 15, however many
Oh,
years.
and
Like
not contributing to a retirement account of her own that she might get through work or something like that.
100%, and also not developing, relevant skills that will make her competitive in the workplace, having an enormous gap on her resume. Like on every level, if something were to happen to the two of them, she is just in a much, much more vulnerable position. So yes, it can work out okay, but you have to put the right protections into place, and very few people do. I think the long-term reality though is just that if one of my favorite phrases that people leave all the time on my videos is, if the man feeds you, he can starve you.
Mm,
Like it's up to him to decide. And by the way, sometimes it's a matter of he's cheating on you, he leaves you for another woman, he's been gambling behind your back, he's dishonest, he's this, that, and the other. But sometimes it's just that he's not really that good with money, or maybe he gets fired from his job, or maybe any number of things happen. So I say all of that to say, I personally myself would not be comfortable with 100% of my financial future being in the hands of a man, any man. You may feel differently, but the reality is you've taken, when you agree to do that, and especially when you don't protect yourself additionally, you have just taken an enormous gamble on this one person. And quite frankly, I just don't think most men have the range.
Money can be tough for a lot of people. I wonder if also too some of the desire to kind of split finances in such a way where one person has like pretty much total control or access, or at least is like, the person bringing in all of the money all of the time is, um I wonder if some of that it comes from like a desire to avoid talking about money. Like it could be easier to just have one person handle it than constantly trying to resolve conflicts and like misunderstandings. Makes me think about like when, in the inverse of that is that we both, at the end of lots of conversations, we both get to feel included and we both get to feel seen and heard. But I mean, it's a pain. Like it's a pain. And I wonder how much of that factors into it too, if there are people who just don't want to deal with talking to each other about this stuff.
I recently read a memoir about a woman who went into her marriage with multiple trust funds and ended up completely at this man's mercy when he cheated on her because she essentially signed everything away to him in the name of love. She allowed him to completely redo her prenup 5 days before the wedding. She openly admits that she went that entire marriage without ever looking at one statement, and that she gave him every single month a total breakdown of her spending, when she
Oh,
was the one who went into this. Listen, and we don't cover a ton of these, but like every year there's at least a few of these memoirs of women in, these really, really rough divorces where
mhm.
they feel completely blindsided. How did I end up here? Blah, 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 blah. And I just have to say, like, at a certain point, women either have agency or we don't. We are either fully equal, independent human beings, adults responsible for our own lives and choices, or we're not. And I do think, like, I don't want to discount very real instances of abuse and coercion and things that there are many situations where women are, being held essentially hostage in relationships. There are also many
Yeah.
situations where there's just not enough money to even survive as a household, let alone to break it into two households.
Yeah.
People stay married in bad situations because they can't afford to get divorced. I don't want to discount any of that. However, at the same time, to your point about wanting to completely avoid it, wanting to not even be aware of the numbers, never have the conversation, not
Yeah.
be part of these decisions, at a certain point, we have to hold ourselves accountable as women and say, it's barely been 50 years that we can even have a credit card, that we can own property, that we can do things in our own name. To be so eager to give up all of that and to go back into this place of voluntary helplessness and voluntary ignorance in service of a very specific kind of love, to me, is we just can't allow ourselves to do that. We can't. And that is why I feel that so many of these romantic stories that we're told are so inherently conservative, because even in the ones where the men don't necessarily, they're not princes or mafia bosses, as you pointed out, or any of these
Sure.
things, almost never is money ever even addressed. The underlying assumption is that if the love is good, if it's a true love story, money won't be a problem. It won't come up. It won't be a problem. And I think that desire to, it's, to me, it's not that different from, the girl math stuff, or you'll see videos like,
Ah,
I let him buy what he wants at the boy store so I can get what I want at the girl store, and like all of that kind of stuff. To me, it just all comes down to this idea of love means on some level the woman infantilizing herself and
mm,
remaining voluntarily ignorant. And I, unfortunately, especially when that is done totally willingly and with no external financial necessity to do so, I find that unfortunately it's just sometimes you got to take the hard lessons.
you know, so much of what we discussed today are the ways that our fantasies for love and really our lifestyles in general, right? are really just financial fantasies. Like that's kind of like what's undergirding all this. I mean, you recently wrote a book about like having people over. You like to host a lot. Um
I do.
like that is that there's like social anxiety beneath that, right? Like I can't have friends over because my place isn't nice enough, or I don't have to cook, or I'll never meet the right guy if I'm not wearing the right thing, or I'll never be happy if I don't find a guy who is making X amount of money or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Like, are those things like actually are social anxieties or romantic anxieties? Are those really just financial anxieties? Is that like are we at the end of the episode of Scooby Doo and we're like ripping the mask off? And it's just like financial anxieties. Here we are again. Like, is that kind of like what's kind of poisoning the well, I suppose, in a lot of our relationship anxiety, both for friendship and romance?
I think it's a big part of it. And I think a lot of what you've touched on there is definitely financial in nature. But I actually think that when you look at the way that we celebrate women and what we celebrate them for, it's all marriage and children. That's it. That's where we throw the party. That's where we like all the photos. That's where we want to see women succeed, quote unquote, or at least where we
Mm.
want to see them apply themselves. And so I think that a lot of the anxiety, because I mean, think about the number of women who are incredibly successful financially in terms of their professional and personal lives on every level in a way that their mother's generation or their grandmother's generation could have never dreamed of. They own their own property, they have an incredible education, a great career they love, great friendships, they travel, they have hobbies,
Yeah.
all of this. And yet they are faced with this narrative that it is not only not enough because they don't have the romantic and familial aspect, but also that, in fact, them being so successful independently has probably come at the cost of them finding a partner because,
Mm.
as we all know, that woman being more vulnerable and more dependent on the man is part of her appeal. Ultimately, I think we teach women that yes, a lot of the anxiety is financial, but there is a certain vulnerability I think that women face when they have quote unquote everything, but they don't have the romantic aspect of it. And
Mm.
that is, to me anyway, the number one thing that needs to be questioned.
I wonder, like, I hear what you're saying, and I am also married. I wonder, like, how when you as you discuss these things, you being married, does that like throw people, or are people like, is that something that people question, or because I mean, yeah, I mean, you're talking hard data, hard facts. These are actually the things that I discuss with my husband on a regular basis. Regular basis. Um because trying to keep our marriage equitable for both of us is something that we both actively work on a lot. But is that something that you feel like your audience has, like, or even people maybe who are outside of your audience who have found your work, have they squared with that or asked you about that in any sort of way?
No, because I have my own money. So if I wanted to leave tomorrow, I could. And maybe I
Hmm.
will keep him on his toes. We've been
You
together for
have to
15
keep them on
years,
their
but
toes.
another 15 is not guaranteed, baby. But so I can always leave whenever I want. We made the decision to not have children because neither of us wants to be a primary parent. I know I have said this a million times. If I had children, I would be divorced because I would be so full of resentment for my husband because I don't want to be a primary parent and I know he doesn't want to be a primary parent. So we would be one of the many couples who is constantly at each other's throats over
Mm.
childcare, domestic labor,
Who's
all
gonna
that
do
stuff.
what? Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
exactly. So I specifically opt out of the things that I know are going to make my marriage way worse and my life way worse, notably having children. And then the third thing is I have a very clear cut system for ways in which he makes my life better, easier, richer, all of those things. And
Hmm.
I just think that a lot of people, I'm sure you've seen all the videos on, it's become its own subgenre now of like women posting their husbands being willfully incompetent, not doing
Yes.
shit, like
Yes.
being
Yes.
making their lives harder, being an extra kid. And the joke now is, let me guess, we don't know him. We can't judge your relationship off a 5-minute video. Then save it. Save it. We don't want to hear it. But the reality of that, behind all of these videos about what your husband is not doing or how he's making your life harder, etc., is that not nearly enough women actually try to make a relatively rational assessment of, like you're saying earlier, making sure the labor is equitable, having the conversations on a regular basis to navigate what's fair, to compromise. They are avoiding all of these conversations because ultimately, I think on some level, a lot of them know that if they were to really lay it out, it would not look good. It would not look
Mm.
good for that man. And I have always found that it is the most sort of ardently critical of heterosexual marriage women who end up in the best marriages because they are extremely demanding that that marriage be only additive. We had a guest on Just Getting Good who said, I want a propeller, not an anchor, you know?
A propeller, not an anchor. That's a piece of wisdom I'm going to be thinking about for some time. And I hope that's the case for our viewers and listeners as well. But Chelsea, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. Thank
Me
you.
too.
That was author and CEO of The Financial Diet, Chelsea Fagan.